Welcome everyone to the final talk in this room, Kohlebunker 2. Welcome also to the people in the stream, if there are any. Well, some organizational notes before. The first thing is there will once again be a Q&A session after the talk. Please wait with your questions until then, but then bring them. Also, people in Zoom can ask questions once again, and we will try to integrate them in the Q&A session after the talk. Also, after the talk, the big Techday is not yet over. There will be dinner, once again, at various different stations all over the place. Please distribute so you don't have to wait for too long and stay hungry. Also, the showcases are still open. Then there's an evening program at 6:30. The chess grandmaster Daniel Blühbaum will give a simultaneous chess exhibition at the Stellwerk room, and you are welcome to watch and have fun looking at that. And then at 7 o'clock, there will be the mountain biker Kilian Bronn giving a talk in the Dampfdom. The talk will also be streamed. And finally, at 10 o'clock, there will be a fireworks in front of the main entrance of the Motor World. But now, to the important part of the evening, our two speakers, Daniel and Max. Let's start with Daniel. I met Daniel Klingmann when trying to put a hoodie onto a humanoid robot and putting it into a go-kart, which was not a great idea, well, the hoodie. But to my surprise, afterwards, I found out he's a mathematician by training, so not so hands-on, usually. So he joined TNG 5 years ago and had several clients with their machine learning topics, and now focuses fully on foundation models for robotics and research in this area, when he's not showcasing what robots and what TNG can do already today at various different exhibitions. Today he's joined by Max Dietsch. He's a TNG colleague for 1.5 years. Max built on his informatics and machine learning background from university at TNG by helping clients to maximize getting the most out of their own data with retrieval augmentation and automating workflows with agentic pipelines. So both of them are perfectly well prepared, both in practice and in theory, and know lots about AI, both with chatbots and beyond that. And now I'm very, very eager to hear what they have to tell us about the digital mind. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. So, the digital mind. Max and I have been talking about how to explain complicated AI concepts in a way that everyone can understand. And our impression is that we can use the intuition we have about our own intelligence and learning and draw analogies between how that works and how AI works. So that's the aim of the talk. I should say we're not neuroscientists, so we've read a lot of papers, but we've simplified quite a lot of concepts. And we've had lots of AI talks today. So the question is, why is AI so important?
AI is basically important to everyone and not only to technical people. And the reason for that is that AI nowadays is everywhere. In Germany, for example, we are currently witnessing a fight between a 1990s fax machine and modern AI. The goal in Germany basically is to finally digitalize and automate a lot of bureaucracy. But how's the state in Paris?
Yes, so in Paris, people are using AI personally. So perhaps you've also been to France and tried to speak English with somebody, looking for directions, and then a French person says, pardon, je ne comprends pas, because they don't understand the language. And it is the case that nowadays we have smartphones with AI, and they have live translation services. So in principle, it's possible for everyone to speak with everybody else in their language live. And indeed, that's the case in France. So these sort of situations where you can't communicate with people will happen less and less in France because they're using AI so much in their personal life.
Yeah, and AI is even influencing our professional life, but not only to the good. In China, for example, companies are already filling entire factory floors with AI and robotics, even to an extent where the Chinese government already forbids to lay off workers on AI grounds.
Yes, but the good news is in America, Trump now has a chatbot with which he can brainstorm more efficiently than ever before. And this might look funny, but this is actually quite close to the reality because the US government has contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with leading AI companies. And one of the things they do want to do is speed up the decision-making process using AI. So to summarize, AI seems to be very important. We've had lots of great talks today, but we'll use analogies from our intelligence to understand at a high level artificial intelligence. We make a disclaimer here. We've simplified a few concepts, and obviously biological processes are very different to digital processes. So at some points, the analogies don't match up completely, but our aim is to explain these complicated concepts using something that we know. So let's get started.
Yes. To lay the groundwork for dynamic processes like learning or cognition, let's first dive into the architecture of both our brain and AI models. On a high level, our human brain can just be imagined as being a collection of a huge amount of neurons. Neurons are able to receive inputs and pass along outputs to other neurons. So they are connected to other neurons. And those connections are called synapses. And actually, if we look at AI, the picture is quite similar. We also have neurons which are connected to each other so that they can pass along information. But this isn't surprising because artificial neural networks are actually inspired by the human brain. Artificial neural networks may look more structured because they are constructed by us, but the core idea is the same. We have simple processing units called neurons. Those are connected to each other, and out of that emerges complex behavior. If you look at a little bit more detail into our brain, we see that the neurons are not scattered at random. Actually, we see clusters, where neurons are more densely connected to each other. And those clusters, or brain regions, often have a very specific function. For example, we have a very specific brain region in our brain where it is specifically focused for visual perception. Another brain region might focus on motor control. What we basically have is functional modularity. And LLMs actually borrow a bit of this intuition. In modern LLMs, we have so-called mixture of experts layers. Those layers contain a lot of experts, and those experts are just very tiny neural networks, so basically small clusters within a big network. Another important component is the router. The router is important because it allows us to selectively engage only a few experts. And that brings me basically to the next topic, sparsity. The goal is that we only want to engage those systems which actually need to be engaged. The human brain, for example, only activates about 1 to 4% of our neurons at any given moment. And you can observe a similar trend in AI as well. We only want to activate a few selected experts, and not all of them. One advantage which arises out of that is that we save a bunch of energy. This was very important for the human from an evolutionary point of view. But even today, our metabolism couldn't really support activating our whole brain at once. And in AI, energy is also a constraint, so saving energy is always a good idea to get more out of those LLMs. Moreover, when we save a lot of computational work, of course, we are faster. And that is very important for large language models. The last advantage brings me actually back to modularity. Because of that, we are able to build specialized components. So components which are solely focused on specific tasks. And this is, in general, a good idea. But this raises a question. Because if we have modularity, what happens if one module suddenly doesn't work anymore? And indeed, in the human brain, this can happen. This can lead to subtle changes in the behavior. For example, in 1953, a patient called Henry Gustav Moleichon underwent brain surgery. As a result, parts of his hippocampus, a specific brain region, was removed. From now on, he wasn't able to build new long-term memory. But the surprising part is that every other ability of his brain stayed perfectly intact. So it would be really cool if we could do the same in our AI models? Could we just deactivate a few selected experts and with that change the behavior of a model? This isn't so easy because the role of an expert within a neural network isn't well defined. It's very fuzzy. So this is basically a hard problem. A hard problem that sounds like a job for TNG. And indeed, during the last year, TNG published a paper about that exact topic. Last year, the model DeepSeek R1 was published, but it has one big problem. It is highly censored. So if you ask a question about a sensitive topic, the model might just refuse your answer. TNG then identified those experts which were most responsible for the censoring behavior of the model. TNG deactivated those experts, and suddenly the model was much more open. So it sometimes answered questions about sensitive topics. But the really interesting part is that the model or the benchmarks of the models stayed roughly the same in comparison to the original model. So we have here the same case like from the mentioned patient, where we have a targeted disruption in our network, and with that we could isolate a function or even a character trait of our model or brain. So let's look at just some raw numbers. The human brain has about 100 trillion to 1,000 trillion synapses, so connections between neurons. But AI models typically today only have about 2 trillion connections between neurons. This is only referring to open source models. We don't know about closed source models like ChatGPT or Gemini. However, this is important because size is typically a big indicator for intelligence. And now we might think that the human brain is well superior to AI models. But AI has one very important advantage. The human brain, specifically the human head, has to fit through the birth canal of a woman. And then the growth of a brain is heavily constrained by our metabolism, by our development, and by our environment. So we are basically kept by biology and evolution. The AI model, on the other hand, is also constrained on energy, or compute, or cost. But you can scale those three factors much more easily than waiting for biology or evolution. Also, a human brain typically operates on about 12 watts of power, whereas the large language models typically need a few kilowatts of power. Here again, we might think that the human brain is superior to AI. But to really say that AI is more efficient in a specific task, we really have to look at a specific task, because there are a lot of tasks where LLMs nowadays are already more efficient than a human brain. Also, a human brain, or specifically a human neuron cell, is optimized to be just that, a human neuron cell. AI, on the other side, is also optimized, but it isn't optimized down to the level of a single neuron cell. So in the next few years, it is expected that AI models will get much more efficient. And now, I already talked about that size matters, at least for intelligence. But to give you an intuition why it is so important, let's look at this example. Here you can see a brain of a chimpanzee and the brain of a human. What you can see is that the human brain is roughly 3 to 4 times larger than the brain of the chimpanzee. And actually, this is the most fundamental difference between the brain of a human and the brain of a chimpanzee. But with that increase in scale comes a dramatic increase in cognitive ability. Humans are able to learn languages, we have a certain cultures, we can attend conferences like the big Techday, and if AI also keeps to increase its compute, its size, and of course its data, it is very plausible that AI will get more intelligent in the next few years. However, size is only the potential, but the process of learning actually fills your potential with structure.
Exactly. So learning. We've seen so far that both a brain and an artificial neural network is a collection of neurons that are connected to each other. And learning is a process by which we strengthen and weaken these connections in order to learn new skills and abilities. So learning doesn't just happen because we have a brain and information, but we need to provide information in the correct way and have an appropriate environment for learning to take place. So, for example, we need an error signal. In the case of humans, these are chemical processes. So, for example, dopamine is used. There's a study from 2004 that looked at patients with, what was it? Parkinson's disease. And they have much less dopamine than people without Parkinson's disease. But if you give them dopamine medication, how quickly they learn by playing games where they win is much higher. So if they win a game, they can learn a lot from that process once they're on the dopamine medication that they can't learn without a dopamine medication. And I guess an analogy in the AI sense would be we need to define error functions that somehow measure the quality of the model's output, of the AI's output. Second thing is, there's no point sending children to university lectures. So we need to stage how we learn. And in school, there are key stages. So for example, you teach someone basic arithmetic before teaching them calculus, or you might teach them to speak and basic language before you ask them to reason about complicated things. And we have this analogy in when we train large language models, where in the first stage we train them on the whole internet. It's called pre-training. This gives them some basic language skills. And in the second stage, we do fine-tuning, where we get them to do tasks specifically like we want them to. So lastly, you need to be sort of active. You need to be awake, not too tired. You need to be aroused in order to learn. The equivalent might be there are learning rates in AI. But in case arousal is a bit complicated to imagine, I have an anecdote from my own life from last week where I learned a lot. And this is, I went to eat ice cream, and I haven't done this in a long time. So when I saw the ice cream, I didn't feel good or bad. But when I ate it, I felt very, very happy. So the day afterwards, I said straight away, okay, I will go to the same ice cream place and I'll get another ice cream. But just seeing the ice cream made me happy because I'd learned this is an indication, seeing ice cream of something good is about to come. So I ate it, it tasted great, so I stayed happy. Then the next day, I was very punctual. I went to the ice place very early, but it was closed. So I was very sad. The reason I was sad is because I'd expected to get something, and my prediction had been wrong. But actually, this facilitated learning, because I went to the timetable of the ice cream place, and I saw they open at 11 o'clock. And now I think for the rest of my life, I'll remember at Richard-Strauss-Straße at 11 o'clock, the ice cream place opens. Because I was so aroused, I'll keep this memory forever. Okay, so there are lots of conditions that you need in order for learning to take place, but we'll focus on the learning processes. There's a maxim in English that says, if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. And this sort of encapsulates the idea that just by trying things yourself, you will learn. Or in particular, when you do something that helps and gets you towards your goal, that behavior is enforced. And if you do something that gets you away from the goal, that behavior is suppressed. So we see this with kids. Bam. When they learn how to walk, they fall over straight away. But with time, they're able to stand maybe a bit longer and then fall over again. They might reach out and accidentally grab something, realize if they do that, they can walk more stably. And after a while, they even learn that they can push up from the floor to get up. And in this situation, the baby isn't thinking heavily about what to do in order to stand, but behavior that's by chance leading to the successful outcome is being reinforced. And funnily enough, nowadays, if you try and teach a robot to walk, you would just train an AI model that does exactly the same thing. Of course, a robot costs maybe 50,000 euros, so you don't push a robot over hundreds of times. Instead, you simulate it in an engine like this. So this is a simulation that has gravity, for example. And you train an AI model with the objective to keep the robot upright and to move forward from the starting position. At the beginning, it's a random process. The AI doesn't know what to do. So it just falls over. But just by chance, sometimes it does a movement that gets it towards its goal. And this behavior is reinforced. So after a while, if you train lots of robots at the same time, you can get a neural network on AI that can perhaps lift one leg properly or lift a second leg. And if you keep doing this process and rewarding the good behavior that happens by chance, at some point you get an AI that can control the robot very well. So in this case, you get an AI where you can even push over the robot and it won't fall over because it's learned how to walk through trial and error. But this is limited, so this works really well for walking, because if you make a decision and it's the wrong one, you fall over straight away and you get the feedback, something bad's happened. But if you're, for example, running a business, you might make decisions over a 1 or 2 year process without seeing any revenue. And so you have to decide what to do without getting positive, negative signals. A simpler analogy is if you play a game with several steps like drafts. You have one move, and then your opponent makes a move, and only at the end would you get a signal you've won or lost. And there's a fundamental problem then in AI called the credit assignment problem, which is a task of finding a good move, even though you've made a series of moves that are good and bad. And the way AI solves this is through the actor-critic model. So this is an approach from the 1990s. We have the actor, this is the player that can make a move. And we have a second AI called the critic that evaluates how good that move is. And this means now the actor who's making the moves can get a signal after every move rather than at the end of the game. And perhaps you're thinking there's a chicken and egg problem. If you're trying to train an AI, the actor and critic at the same time, how do they get signals that they can use to reinforce their behaviors? And the surprising thing is it works. There's a bootstrapping mechanism where if you play it long enough, the actor and the critic learn at the same time and can in fact play simple games better than any humans. So this actor-critic approach from the 90s worked well for simple games that had several steps. But if we think about how humans play chess, it's slightly different. So as a human, you still have the first model where you think, OK, what moves can I do? And then you have the second model that perhaps evaluates how good that move is. But actually, we go one step further. Because we know the rules of chess, we simulate future moves. So we imagine what our opponents would do and what we would do in response. And based on the complexity of the board position, we decide how many moves to look at. So if it's a very simple position, then we might only simulate 1 or 2 moves. And if it's a complicated position, we'll simulate lots of moves and go very deep into the game. And exactly this approach was used in 2017 by Google DeepMind to train a neural network that could play chess better than any human. So again, they had these 2 models. The first one decides what to do, and the second one, the value estimator, decides how good that move is. But on top of that, we simulate lots of games, and we give the rules of the game to the model. And then we, before deciding what move to do, we simulate lots of games, and we do a search using Monte Carlo tree search, before deciding what the best move is. And with the simulation, we get an AI that plays chess better than any human. So we've seen simulation is helpful for playing even more complicated games. But there are a few other advantages that we have when we simulate things. So one of the problems we have training neural networks is that if we train them for a new task, they tend to forget previous tasks. This is called catastrophic forgetting. And this happens with the brain, but also with artificial neural networks. And the way humans overcome this, probably, is by replaying the past whilst we're sleeping. And this way, they get stored into the long-term memory. And it allows us to sort of learn new things without forgetting old things. And we have a really nice analogy in AI, which is called episode replay. So if we have a model that can do a few things, and we want to train it on a new task, then whilst training on this new task, we also give it data that lets it remember the old tasks. And in this way, prevent catastrophic forgetting. OK. So far, we've seen we can learn by trial and error, and we can learn by simulating the future. But in fact, if this was the only thing we had, then learning would be still very inefficient. So for example, if you wanted ice cream, you might also make the mistake of going there at 10 o'clock rather than 11 o'clock, but you won't, because I've told you, it opens at 11 o'clock. And Charlie Munger has a great way of explaining this. He says, my prescription for misery is to learn everything from your own experience, minimizing what you learn from others. And one of the things that really almost uniquely makes us almost uniquely human is that we have a theory of mind. So we can look at other people and interpret their intentions. So as an example, if your parents are teaching you to tie your shoelaces, they might kneel down initially to get to your shoes and then do the motion with the hands. And because we have theory of mind, we can recognize that the motion of kneeling down has nothing to do with the process of tying our shoelaces. And this way distinguish the actions that are useful and those actions that are not useful. In AI, the equivalent would be imitation learning, which is what I focus on professionally. So if you want to train a robot to act in the real world, you do it by copying the motions of a human. In this picture, we have two robots. The robots at the top in blue are the industrial robots that complete the task. And the hands at the bottom, they are small robots that are controlled by humans. The industrial robots just copy exactly what the humans do, and you collect this data. If you collect enough data, then you're actually able to do fairly complicated tasks already. So in this case, for example, a generalist collected a few thousand hours of this type of data and trained an AI to control a robot to do very fine work. In this case, closing zip ties. And we're not there yet. This isn't used in production very much, but more and more it will be the case that AIs control robots in the real world and that you can instruct them just using language. And the way they learned this is by imitating humans. So just as a quick summary, we've seen three learning processes. The first one is we just learn by doing, and we get a direct reward or punishment. So for example, when we learn to walk, we fall over, and we learn not to do that again. The second one is we have model-based learning, where we simulate the world. Our human brain has a fairly complicated model of the world. When we train an AI, it's normally very specialized, and this is one of the key differences. So if you train an AI to play chess, then it just knows the rules of chess. And lastly, we have theory of mind, and that enables us to do lots of things, in particular to learn very efficiently. And more, this will also be used to control robots. And as a last summary, we've moved from learning from consequences to simulation to learning from others.
And after we learned new capabilities, of course, we want to use those capabilities. For this, we often need some thoughts, right? And the thinking process is which we want to focus on next. However, this topic is highly sensitive because we don't exactly know how our brain actually thinks. And the same thing is true for AI. But, of course, we can build some intuitions for basic mechanisms. For example, it is pretty clear that in our brain, we need somewhat stable signals, right? So imagine that during any moment, a lot of signals arrive at our brain. And our brain amplifies or inhibits signals. But why don't we just end up in a situation where we have one set of neurons, which is only very weakly activated, and another set of neurons, which is very hardly activated or very strongly activated? And this, of course, would be a very harmful situation for both AI and our human brain. For our human brain, for example, too little activity would lead to dying synapses. Too much activity would lead to a condition called excitotoxicity. So brain tissue is being damaged. However, we want to have a mechanism in our brain as well as in AI so that our neural activity stays within a healthy range. And such techniques are often called normalization. In our brain, we have plenty of them. To put out two important ones, the first one is that we always want to scale our neuron activity relative to its nearby population. We don't look at individual neurons in isolation. Also, we have so-called inhibitory neurons in our head, and those neurons basically suppress runaway activity, and they act as a biological ceiling. And in AI, we have normalization techniques basically across the whole stack. We have normalization mechanisms before layers, after layers, and sometimes within layers. In fact, it wouldn't be possible to train very deep neural networks because it would be highly unstable. So we want to have stable signals, but it would also be nice to have predictable signals, right? But this intuition is at least somewhat wrong, because in our brain, about 50% of synaptical transmissions are lost. But this isn't a bad thing, because this also increases the robustness of our brain. And we have similar cases for AI. For example, low-precision hardware can introduce randomness or indeterminism. But we also sometimes want to insert randomness into our training process. For example, there's a mechanism called dropout, where you randomly deactivate specific neurons during training. And as a result, your neural network will get more robust. And of course, there are other techniques like temperature or sampling techniques. For example, when you want to increase your creativity of your language model. However, from time to time, we have the feeling that our neural network isn't not only indeterministic, but also somewhat strange, right? Because there are those strange hallucinations. And now we have to understand that our brain, as well as AI, are just huge prediction machines. But the important thing is that we don't predict truth. We only predict the most likely or most probable next state. In LLMs, for example, we get a text input pattern, and we want to predict the most likely next word. And we can see a similar example in humans as well. If you look, for example, at a slide, you can probably see two dogs, right? However, there are only black dots on the slide. Every edge, every shape, every darkness which appears in your head only appears there because your brain fills in the missing information. It just predicts the missing information based on the most probable, most likely explanation. And of course, this is based on our prior experience. We tend to see dogs somewhat every day, or at least kind of often. So the most probable and most likely explanation for this picture are just two dogs in our head. So sometimes when we refer to hallucinations in LLMs, what we are actually seeing are symptoms of just a huge pattern matching machine. There are also some other cases in humans, for example, when you see faces in clouds or in trees or in stones. But actually, of course, there aren't any faces. So now we covered a lot about signals, and now we want to get into some meat here and look into our actually internal representations. So what do we do with the signals that arrive at our head? And for that, let's start with a simple puzzle. We can see in this equation, so roller skates minus wheels plus blades, that from a strict mathematical point of view, this equation is not very well defined, because I didn't tell you how to add or how to subtract images. However, our brain is able to very quickly and very intuitively derive a solution here. Because as anyone else here also thinking about ice skates as being the solution, and at least it feels a bit weird, because here I basically wrote down an equation, but we didn't actually calculate something in our brain, right? And one important thing here is that we had some internal representation about concepts in our mind. And one important thing here is, for example, the Happian learning theory. This can be summarized with the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. So neurons that are activated together tend to be more strongly connected to each other. And those groups of neurons actually are able to represent entire concepts in our brain. And actually, there's more modern evidence that points into a similar direction, because fMRI studies have shown that brain activation patterns actually contain some semantic meaning. Put differently, if a computer can get to know you, the computer eventually, after a while, can predict if you are currently thinking about an apple or about a table. To put it more visually, when you think about a concept, like in our equation, for example, the roller skates, there are some particular neurons being activated in your brain. And this activation pattern is somewhat deterministic. However, the important thing is that we don't know how those internal representations in our head look like. But what we know is how those internal representations look like in AI models, because they just look like vectors. And now it is very important to remember that those vectors, which basically just represent activation patterns of LLMs, they contain semantic meaning. And what we wanted to do in our equation is that we want to add or subtract semantic meaning. We want to add or to subtract concepts. And with vectors, addition or subtraction is well defined. So what we could do, we could just plot those vectors in our 3D coordinate system. And because addition and subtraction is well defined here, and we just want to add or subtract concepts, we can do those operations in this latent space. And what we will see is that after doing the subtraction of wheels and adding back in the blades, we arrive at the internal representation, which is a vector in the case of LLMs. This vector just represents the concept of ice skates for LLMs. So indeed, we could solve this equation very elegantly, at least for the case of LLMs. But it's important to know that we don't know how the internal representations look in our head. There's no evidence that we have similar things going on. So we've done basically quite a journey. We looked at the architecture of our brain, at AI models. We learned how our brain or AI models can learn new things. And finally, we at least thought about our internal thinking process. But for any of those comparisons, we just used models.
Exactly, and there's a great quote that says that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I hope with this talk is that you see parallels between human and artificial intelligence. And indeed, our impression is that there are lots of parallels. So the Old Testament starts with at the beginning of the Old Testament is written, so God created man in his own image. And my impression is more and more that we see this in AI as well. So if you're thinking just from a remote work setup, you could almost be convinced that AIs are software developers. So this graphic, I think, is quite interesting. On the x-axis is time, and it starts at the year 2020, and goes to the year 2025. And on the y-axis is basically how complicated tasks the AI can solve. And according to some measurements, nowadays, AI can solve tasks that would take humans 6 or 7 hours to do. And so the impression is that just if you had a digital colleague who was an AI, he could almost convince you that he was a human being. So our impression is AI is getting, or there are lots of parallels between human and artificial intelligence, and that we're digitalizing some of these processes. And perhaps it's not too unreasonable to say that the AI of the future, when it writes its own genesis and explains its own beginning, will start off by saying, so humans created AI in their own image. Thank you very much.